I'm Alex Martinez, 25, and I never thought my graphic design skills would teach me more about deception than my own father ever would. When Dad insisted I pack light for our family trip to Europe, I thought he was being practical. I had no idea he was setting me up for the most humiliating moment of my life. Standing alone at Denver International Airport, watching his plane taxi away while I held a worthless piece of paper instead of a boarding pass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I'm saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Martinez household meant mastering the art of reading between the lines. My father, Robert, or Rob, as he insisted everyone call him, owned a mid-sized construction company that specialized in commercial renovations. From the outside, we looked like a solid middle-class family, living in a comfortable suburban neighborhood in Lakewood, just outside Denver. Dad drove a pristine black F-150, always wore pressed khakis and polo shirts with his company logo, and spoke with the confident authority of a man who built things with his hands. But beneath that polished exterior was someone who treated relationships like construction projects. Everything had to be built according to his specifications, and if you didn't follow his blueprint exactly, the whole structure would come crashing down. My older brother Casey learned this early, constantly reshaping himself to fit Dad's vision of the perfect son. I took a different approach, quietly pursuing my own interests while trying to stay under his radar. My parents divorced when I was 16, after years of increasingly tense arguments about money, control, and Dad's need to micromanage every aspect of our family life. Mom, Linda, had been a kindergarten teacher before marriage, but Dad convinced her to stay home to manage his business paperwork and household affairs. When she finally filed for divorce, he had been making major financial decisions without consulting her, including taking out a second mortgage on our house to expand his business. The divorce proceedings revealed Dad's true character. He fought for joint custody not out of love for Casey and me, but because it reduced his child support obligations. He contested every asset, questioned every expense, and turned what should have been a straightforward division of property into an 18-month legal battle that drained both parents' resources and left lasting emotional scars. During this time, I threw myself into art and design. Creating visual stories became my escape from the chaos at home. I spent hours in my room sketching, learning Photoshop, and building websites for local small businesses. By senior year, I had decided to pursue graphic design at the University of Colorado, Denver, choosing to stay local partly for the in-state tuition and partly to remain close to Mom, who was struggling to rebuild her life. Dad remarried when I was 19 to Elena, a real estate agent he met during a property renovation project. Elena came with her own 15-year-old daughter, Sophie, and suddenly our carefully negotiated custody arrangements became even more complicated. Dad seemed determined to prove that his new family was superior to his original one, constantly comparing Elena's success to Mom's struggles and Sophie's academic achievements to mine and Casey's. What made this particularly painful was how Dad used these comparisons as weapons. During our mandatory Sunday dinners at his house, he would casually mention Elena's latest real estate sale while noting that Mom was still working part-time at a daycare center. He would praise Sophie's advanced placement classes while questioning why I had chosen such an impractical major as graphic design. By the time I graduated college at 23, I had learned to navigate Dad's emotional landmines with practiced care. I worked freelance, building a client base of small businesses and nonprofits, while supplementing my income with part-time work at a local marketing agency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had my own apartment, paid my own bills, and made my own decisions about clients and projects. The relative peace lasted about 18 months. Then came the phone call that would change everything. It was a Thursday evening in early March when Dad called with unusual enthusiasm in his voice. Alex, sweetheart, he began using the affectionate tone that always made me suspicious. I've been thinking about our family, about how we need to spend more quality time together. Elena and I have been discussing it, and we've decided to plan something really special. I muted my laptop where I had been working on a logo design for a local coffee shop. What kind of special? I asked cautiously. A family trip to Europe, he announced. All of us together. You, me, Casey, Elena, and Sophie. 2 weeks touring through Italy, France, and Spain. Elena found this amazing travel package through her real estate connections. We leave in 6 weeks.
The timeline immediately raised red flags. 6 weeks wasn't enough time to request passport expediting if anyone needed one, book affordable accommodations, or save money for such an expensive trip. But Dad seemed so excited, and it had been years since he had proposed spending significant time together as a family. "That sounds incredible, Dad," I said carefully. "Can you send me some details about the itinerary and costs? I'll need to check my work schedule and budget." There was a slight pause. "Of course, honey. But don't worry too much about the money. This is my treat for the family. Elena and I want to create some lasting memories with everyone." That should have been my second red flag. Dad never paid for anything without extensive negotiations about expectations and reciprocal obligations. When Casey and I were teenagers, he would itemize the cost of family outings and discuss how we could contribute through chores or improved grades. Over the next week, Dad sent several emails with partial information, beautiful photos of Mediterranean coastlines, links to travel blogs about European cuisine, and enthusiastic descriptions of historical sites we would visit. But when I asked specific questions about flights, hotels, or daily itineraries, his responses were vague. "Trust me, sweetheart," became his standard reply. "I'm handling all the logistics. You just focus on getting ready for an amazing adventure." Casey seemed equally puzzled when I called him. "He's been super secretive about the details," my brother admitted. "When I asked about taking time off work, he just said to request the whole last 2 weeks of April. No specific dates, no return flight information. It's weird, but you know how Dad gets with surprises." I did know how Dad got with surprises. They usually involved elaborate presentations designed to showcase his generosity while carefully concealing the strings attached. But the promise of 2 weeks in Europe with potential reconciliation with my father was tempting enough to override my usual caution. 3 weeks before the departure date Dad had finally provided, I received a detailed packing list via email. The subject line read, "Important, packing instructions for our European adventure." The list was oddly specific and surprisingly minimal. One small carry-on suitcase, 3 changes of clothes, minimal toiletries, no electronics except my phone, and absolutely no checked luggage. "Pack light," Dad emphasized during our next phone conversation. "We'll be moving around a lot, and dragging heavy suitcases through European train stations is a nightmare. Trust me on this one." The instruction felt reasonable enough, though something about his insistence on minimal packing nagged at me. When I mentioned it to Mom during our weekly coffee date, she frowned. "Your father always overpacked for every trip we ever took. Remember that weekend camping trip when you were 12? He brought 3 coolers and enough gear for a month in the wilderness. This doesn't sound like him." But I convinced myself that perhaps Dad had learned from experience, or maybe Elena had influenced his travel style. I spent the week before departure carefully selecting versatile pieces that could mix and match, rolling everything efficiently into my smallest suitcase. The night before we were supposed to leave, Dad called with final instructions. "Be at the airport by 5 a.m. sharp. Terminal B, departures level. Don't be late. European flights don't wait for stragglers." "Should I meet you at a specific gate?" I asked. "Just head to the international departures area. I'll find you. And remember, pack light, bring your passport, and get ready for the trip of a lifetime." As I fell asleep that night, my small suitcase packed and ready by the door, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Despite all the warning signs, some part of me still hoped this trip might finally bridge the gap between my father and me. I had no idea that I was about to learn the most painful lesson of my adult life about trust and manipulation and the difference between a father's love and a father's control.
To understand how I ended up stranded at that airport, you need to understand the pattern of behavior that had been building for years. My father's relationship with control didn't start with the divorce. It had been the foundation of our family dynamics since I could remember. Growing up, Dad operated on what I later learned therapists call conditional love. His affection came with performance metrics. When Casey made varsity soccer, Dad would beam with pride and take him out for expensive dinners. When Casey struggled with algebra, Dad would withdraw emotionally, making cutting comments about not applying yourself and wasting opportunities. I learned early to be a chameleon, adapting my interests and personality to match whatever would earn Dad's approval that week. If he was excited about a construction project, I would ask detailed questions about blueprints and building materials. If he was frustrated with business challenges, I would listen sympathetically and offer solutions that made him feel respected and competent. This exhausting dance became second nature, but it also taught me to read people's motivations with almost supernatural accuracy. By age 10, I could predict Dad's mood swings based on subtle changes in his voice, posture, or the way he organized his tools in the garage. These skills would later make me an excellent graphic designer, understanding what clients really wanted beyond what they said they wanted. But they also trapped me in a constant state of hypervigilance around my own father. The construction business provided the perfect metaphor for Dad's parenting style. Everything had to be built according to his specifications, using his chosen materials, following his timeline. Deviation from the plan wasn't just discouraged, it was treated as a personal betrayal. When I expressed interest in art classes instead of business courses, Dad didn't just disagree. He acted as if I had deliberately chosen to waste his investment in my future. "I'm not paying for you to play with crayons," he would say whenever the subject came up. "Art is a hobby, not a career. You need something practical, something that builds wealth." This attitude extended to every aspect of our lives. Dad chose our family vacations based on locations where he could network with potential business contacts. He selected our neighborhood because it projected the right image to clients who hired Dad's company. Elena's arrival in our lives amplified these tendencies rather than moderating them. Where I had hoped a new relationship might soften Dad's rigid approach to family management, Elena seemed to validate and even encourage his controlling behavior. She had her own 15-year-old daughter to protect and advance, and she quickly recognized that aligning with Dad's methods would benefit Sophie's position in the newly blended family. The Sunday dinners at Dad and Elena's house became elaborate productions designed to showcase their superior family unit. Elena would prepare elaborate meals while discussing her latest real estate successes. Sophie would share her academic achievements and extracurricular honors. Dad would hold court at the head of the table, directing conversations and ensuring everyone understood the pecking order. Meanwhile, Casey and I were expected to play supporting roles in this domestic theater. We were the before picture that highlighted how much Dad's life had improved with Elena and Sophie. Our struggles became evidence of Mom's inadequate parenting. Our successes were reframed as validation of Dad's guidance despite the obstacles Mom had created. The financial manipulation started subtly. Dad would offer to pay for something, car repairs, dental work, textbooks, then use that expense as leverage in future conversations. "After everything I've done for you" became his standard opening whenever I expressed opinions he didn't like or made choices he didn't approve of. When I graduated college and started working freelance, Dad initially seemed proud of my independence, but that pride quickly soured when he realized my financial independence meant reduced control over my decisions. He began offering unsolicited business advice, critiquing my client choices, and suggesting I should focus on more serious design work for larger corporations. "You're wasting your talent on these little non-profit projects," he would say during our increasingly tense phone conversations. "Elena knows people in corporate marketing. She could make some introductions if you're serious about building a real career." The subtext was always clear. Accept his version of help or accept his disappointment. There was no middle ground where I could succeed on my own terms and still maintain his approval. Casey handled this differently than I did.
As the older child and only son, he bore the full weight of Dad's expectations for continuing the family construction business. While I could sometimes fly under the radar by being the artistic one, Casey was groomed from childhood to be Dad's successor.
The pressure nearly broke him. By his mid-20s, Casey was drinking heavily and jumping between jobs, unable to commit to Dad's business, but also unable to forge his own path without feeling like he was betraying our father's dreams. Our conversations during this period were painful. He knew Dad was manipulative and controlling, but he also felt guilty for resenting the man who had given him everything. Sometimes I think about just disappearing, Casey confided during one particularly dark conversation. Just getting in my car and driving until I find somewhere Dad has never been and starting over with a new name. I understood the impulse. There were months when I seriously considered moving to another state, maybe Portland or Austin, somewhere with a thriving arts community where I could build a client base without the constant pressure of Dad's expectations and Elena's comparisons. But running away felt like admitting defeat, and some stubborn part of me refused to give Dad that satisfaction. I was determined to prove that I could build a successful life on my own terms while maintaining some kind of relationship with my family. This determination made me vulnerable to Dad's next manipulation strategy, the promise of reconciliation. About 6 months before the Europe trip announcement, Dad had started making overtures about healing old wounds and bringing the family back together. He would call occasionally just to chat, asking about my work and expressing interest in my projects without immediately offering criticism or unsolicited advice. These conversations felt like glimpses of the father I had always wanted, someone who was genuinely curious about my life and proud of my accomplishments. When he complimented a logo I had designed for a local animal shelter, I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since childhood. You know, Alex, I think I may have been too hard on you about the art thing. Seeing your work now, I realize you've got real talent. Maybe there's more money in this graphic design business than I thought. The validation was intoxicating. After years of feeling like I had to justify my career choices, having Dad acknowledge my skills felt like finally earning his respect. I began to hope that maturity and his marriage to Elena had mellowed his need to control everything and everyone around him. This hope made me vulnerable when he called about the Europe trip. The timing seemed perfect, a grand gesture to mark our improved relationship and create new positive memories to replace the painful ones from my childhood and the divorce years. Looking back, I can see how carefully he had prepared the ground for this manipulation. The months of improved communication weren't genuine reconciliation, they were reconnaissance, designed to identify my emotional vulnerabilities and determine exactly what kind of bait would be most effective. But in the moment, sitting in my apartment planning for what I believed would be a healing family vacation, I felt hopeful for the first time in years about my relationship with Dad. I was so focused on the possibility of finally having the father I had always wanted that I ignored every red flag my experience should have taught me to recognize. The enthusiasm in Dad's voice during that first phone call about Europe should have been my biggest warning sign. Robert Martinez didn't do spontaneous. He didn't do generous without strings attached. And he certainly didn't plan expensive family vacations without months of careful budgeting and detailed spreadsheets outlining everyone's financial contributions. But there he was, practically bubbling over with excitement about this amazing travel package Elena had discovered through her real estate connections. When I asked for specifics about the package, Dad's explanations became surprisingly vague. "It's one of those insider deals," he explained when I pressed for details about the travel company. "Elena's client works in hospitality management and offered us this incredible opportunity. Sometimes you have to trust the process instead of analyzing every detail to death." The phrase, "trust the process," was classic Dad speak for, "stop asking questions that might interfere with my plans."
I had heard variations of it throughout my childhood, whenever he made unilateral decisions about family matters. When I called Casey to compare notes, my brother seemed equally puzzled by Dad's sudden transformation into a carefree vacation planner. He kept talking about making memories and quality family time, Casey told me. When I asked if Elena and Sophie were excited about the trip, he got weird and changed the subject. Then he started going on about how we don't appreciate family enough and how some people would kill for this opportunity. The guilt tripping was another familiar tactic. Dad had a talent for reframing any question about his plans as evidence of ingratitude or lack of family loyalty. But Casey and I were both desperate enough for a genuine relationship with our father that we convinced each other to ignore our instincts. Maybe he's really changed, Casey said hopefully. Maybe Elena has been good for him. Maybe he wants to repair things with us before it's too late. I wanted to believe that too. So when Dad called a few days later with more details, I tried to focus on his enthusiasm rather than the continuing vagueness of his answers. We'll fly into Rome, then take trains through Italy, France, and Spain. Lots of flexibility to explore, taste authentic cuisine, see some incredible art. I thought you'd especially appreciate the museums and architecture, Alex. The fact that he had remembered my interest in art and design felt significant. Dad rarely acknowledged my professional interests, let alone planned activities around them. Maybe this trip really was his attempt to connect with who I had become rather than who he wanted me to be. But when I asked about specific museums or cities we'd visit, Dad's answers remained frustratingly general. "We'll play it by ear," he said. "Part of the adventure is discovering things as we go." This was completely opposite to Dad's usual travel style. On family trips during my childhood, he had planned every activity, researched every restaurant, and created detailed itineraries that left no time unaccounted for. Spontaneity made him anxious. He preferred knowing exactly what to expect and having backup plans for every possible scenario. And Lena's involvement in the planning added another layer of confusion. When I mentioned the trip to Mom during one of our weekly coffee meetings, she looked genuinely surprised. "Elena is planning a vacation that includes you and Casey?" Mom asked. "That seems unusual. She's never shown much interest in including you kids in their family activities." This was true. In the 3 years since Dad's remarriage, Elena had maintained polite but distant relationships with Casey and I. She wasn't hostile exactly, but she made it clear that her priorities lay with Sophie and her own extended family. The idea of her pushing for an expensive European vacation that included Dad's children from his first marriage didn't fit the pattern. When I mentioned Mom's observation to Dad, his response was surprisingly defensive. "Elena is more generous than you give her credit for," he said coldly. "She understands the importance of family unity, even when others seem determined to create division." The implicit criticism of Mom was typical, but the edge in Dad's voice suggested I had touched a nerve. For someone supposedly excited about inclusive family bonding, he seemed remarkably sensitive to any questions about Elena's role in planning the trip. The first concrete detail that truly alarmed me came during a family dinner at Dad and Elena's house 2 weeks after the initial announcement. Sophie, who had been unusually quiet during the meal, suddenly looked up from her pasta and asked, "Dad Rob, when exactly are we leaving for Europe?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Dad's jaw tightened visibly. Casey and I exchanged glances across the table. "We're still finalizing some details, sweetheart," Elena said, carefully, not meeting Sophie's eyes. "Why don't you finish your dinner?"
But Sophie, 15 and unaware of the adult undercurrents swirling around the table, persisted. "I just need to know because I have that science competition the last week of April, and I don't want to miss it if we're traveling then." Dad cleared his throat. "Sophie won't be joining us for this particular trip," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is more of a sibling bonding experience for Alex, Casey, and me." Now Elena was staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable. Sophie looked genuinely confused, and I felt a cold certainty settling in my stomach. The family trip that was supposed to include everyone apparently didn't include Dad's stepdaughter after all. "What about Elena?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Is she coming with us?" Another long pause. "Elena will be staying home to take care of some business matters," Dad said finally. "Real estate doesn't stop for vacations." Casey set down his fork. "So it's just the three of us? You, me, and Alex?" "That's right," Dad said, his enthusiasm suddenly sounding forced. "A chance for us to reconnect without distractions, just like old times." But it wasn't like old times at all. Our childhood family trips had always included Mom and usually involved carefully planned activities designed around Dad's business networking opportunities. This mysterious European adventure seemed designed around nothing except getting Casey and me away from our normal lives for 2 weeks. After dinner, I cornered Elena in the kitchen while she was loading the dishwasher. "Are you really okay with not coming on this trip?" I asked quietly. Elena's hands stilled for a moment before she resumed stacking plates. "Your father thinks it's important for him to spend time with you kids," she said, without looking at me. "I support that." There was something in her tone, relief, concern, that I couldn't quite identify. But it was clear this conversation was making her uncomfortable. "Elena," I pressed gently, "is everything okay? With the trip, I mean." She turned to face me then, and for just a moment, I saw something that looked like pity in her eyes. "Alex, honey," she said carefully, "sometimes your father gets ideas about what's best for the family. I've learned it's easier to let him handle things his way." The freezing sent chills down my spine. Let him handle things? Not support his decisions, not agree with his plans. Let him handle things, as if she was stepping aside to avoid being caught in the blast radius of whatever Dad was planning. Driving home that night, I tried to make sense of the evening's revelations. A family trip that didn't include Dad's wife or stepdaughter, a vacation planned by Elena that Elena wasn't attending, a spontaneous adventure from a man who never did anything spontaneously. I called Casey as soon as I got home. "Did tonight feel weird to you?" I asked without preamble. "The whole thing feels weird," he admitted. "Dad's acting like this is some kind of father-son bonding experience, but he's including you, which makes it father-children bonding, I guess. And Elena looked like she wanted to be anywhere else when Sophie asked about the dates." "What if this isn't about bonding at all?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in my mind. Casey was quiet for a long moment. "Like what?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but nothing about this feels right. The secrecy, the vague planning, Elena's weird behavior. Maybe we should just bow out gracefully." "And deal with Dad's reaction to that?" Casey laughed bitterly. "You know how he gets when people don't follow his plans. He'll make our lives miserable for months and probably drag Mom into it somehow." This was true. Dad's responses to perceived rejection were always disproportionate and designed to punish not just the person who disappointed him, but anyone in their support network. Declining the trip would likely result in months of cold treatment, passive-aggressive comments, and deliberate exclusion from any future family events. "Maybe we're overthinking this," Casey continued. "Maybe he really does just want to spend time with us. Maybe Alana encouraged him to plan something special for his kids from his first marriage. Maybe she's staying home because she wants to give us space to reconnect with Dad." I wanted to believe that interpretation, but my instincts were screaming warnings. Everything about this trip felt like an elaborate setup for something, though I couldn't imagine what Dad might be planning that required getting Casey and me out of the country for 2 weeks. As the departure date approached, the red flags multiplied, but so did the pressure to ignore them. The packing instructions email arrived exactly 3 weeks before our supposed departure date, and reading it felt like studying a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Dad's typically obsessive attention to detail was nowhere to be found, replaced by oddly specific restrictions that made no logical sense for a 2-week European vacation. "One small carry-on bag only," the email emphasized in bold letters. "Absolutely no checked luggage. We'll be moving frequently between cities, and large bags will slow us down. Pack 3 complete outfits maximum. We can do laundry as needed." 3 outfits for 14 days in Europe seemed impossibly minimal, especially considering we'd supposedly be visiting multiple countries with different climates and cultural expectations for dress. When I called to clarify, Dad's response was uncharacteristically impatient. "Alex, honey, you're overthinking this," he said, using the condescending tone that always made my teeth clench. "European travelers pack light. Americans always bring too much stuff and look like tourists. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." But Dad had never been to Europe. In all my 25 years, our family had never traveled internationally, except for one disastrous trip to Cabo when I was 12, where Dad spent the entire week complaining about the food, the heat, and the exchange rate. The idea that he had suddenly become an expert on European travel customs was absurd. The electronics restrictions were even more puzzling. Bring only your phone, no laptops, tablets, cameras, or other devices. We want to be present in the moment, not distracted by technology. This from a man who traveled everywhere with his laptop, tablet, 2 phones, and enough charging cables to power a small office. Dad's construction business relied heavily on digital communication. He typically checked email compulsively and took work calls even during family dinners. The idea of him voluntarily disconnecting for 2 weeks was as believable as him suddenly developing an interest in interpretive dance. When I shared these concerns with my best friend Jordan over coffee, she looked genuinely alarmed. "Alex, this sounds like the setup for a true crime documentary. Mysterious trip, no electronics, minimal luggage, vague destination details. Are you sure your dad isn't having some kind of breakdown?" Jordan had known my family since college and had witnessed enough of Dad's manipulative behavior to be automatically suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. Her directness was exactly what I needed to hear, even though I wasn't ready to accept it. "He's just trying to create a meaningful experience," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Maybe he's been reading about digital detox travel or something." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Your father reads construction trade magazines and business journals. When has he ever shown interest in trendy travel concepts?" She had a point, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that something was seriously wrong with this entire scenario. I was too invested in the possibility of reconciliation to back out based on suspicions alone. The financial aspects of the trip remained mysteriously vague, despite my repeated attempts to clarify my expected contributions. Every time I brought up costs, Dad would wave off my concerns with variations of the same response. "Don't worry about money, sweetheart. This is my treat. Elena and I want to do something special for the family." But Dad never gave treats without detailed discussions of their value and his expectations for gratitude. When Dad paid for Casey's car repairs the previous year, we heard about the expense and his generosity for months afterward. The idea that he would quietly absorb the cost of an expensive European vacation without constantly reminding us of his sacrifice was completely out of character. Casey was having his own troubling conversations with Dad about the trip details. When my brother asked about hotel reservations and transportation between cities, Dad became evasive and defensive. "I've got everything handled," Dad told him. "Sometimes you have to let other people take care of things instead of trying to control every detail yourself." The projection was stunning. Dad was literally describing his own behavior while criticizing Casey for asking reasonable questions about a major international trip. 2 weeks before departure, I decided to take a more direct approach. I called Dad and asked for specific flight information so I could arrange transportation to the airport and notify my clients about my extended absence. "We're flying United, international terminal, departures level, be there by 5 a.m. sharp on April 20th. "What's our departure time?" "Early morning flight. Don't worry about the specifics. Just be there when I told you to be there." The non-answer was infuriating, but when I pressed for more details, Dad's tone shifted from evasive to irritated. "Alex, honey, you're overthinking this," he said, using the condescending tone that always made my teeth clench. "European travelers pack light. Americans always bring too much stuff and look like tourists. Trust me, I know what I'm doing."
The mention of an attitude adjustment was particularly telling.
In Dad's worldview, any resistance to his plans or requests for clarification were evidence of a bad attitude that needed correction. He had used similar language during my teenage years, whenever I questioned his decisions or expressed preferences that didn't align with his vision for our family. The phrase also revealed his true expectations for the trip. This wasn't about mutual bonding or creating shared memories. It was about reestablishing his authority over Casey and me, possibly in response to our increasing independence as adults. Elena's behavior during this period became increasingly strange. When I stopped by their house to return a borrowed book, I found her in the kitchen stress cleaning, wiping down already spotless counters with aggressive efficiency. "Looking forward to having the house to yourself for 2 weeks?" I asked, trying to make light conversation. Elena's movements stilled. "I suppose it will be quiet," she said carefully. "Sophie and I will have to find ways to entertain ourselves." There was something forced about her casualness, as if she was performing the role of a woman looking forward to a peaceful break rather than actually feeling that way. "Elena," I said gently, "is everything okay? You seem stressed about something." She turned to face me, and for a moment I thought she might confide whatever was troubling her. Instead, she forced a bright smile and said, "Just the usual pre-travel nerves. I always worry when Robert travels for business." But this wasn't a business trip, and Elena knew that. Her slip suggested she was thinking about Dad's plans in terms of work rather than family vacation, which raised entirely new questions about what he might actually be planning. The final red flag came from an unexpected source. 3 days before departure, I received a call from Casey's ex-girlfriend, Michelle, whom I had remained friendly with after their breakup. "Alex, I hope this isn't overstepping, but I ran into your dad at the bank yesterday, and something he said has been bothering me." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" "He was talking to one of the managers about temporary account access or something like that. I couldn't hear everything, but I definitely heard him mention your name and Casey's name. When he saw me, he seemed really uncomfortable and ended the conversation quickly." Temporary account access. The phrase sent chills through me. Why would Dad need access to Casey's and my bank accounts while we were supposedly on vacation together? "Are you sure you heard correctly?" I asked, though I already knew Michelle wasn't the type to imagine things or create drama. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "And Alex, he looked, I don't know how to describe it, guilty? Like someone who had been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing." That night, I lay awake, replaying every conversation, every strange detail, every evasive answer Dad had given about this trip. The pattern was clear once I stopped trying to rationalize it away. This wasn't a vacation, it was something else entirely. But it was too late to back out gracefully. Dad had already told extended family about our European adventure. He had sent photos to Elena's social media showing happy family preparations. Canceling now would require explaining suspicions I couldn't prove, and Dad's retaliation for such a public humiliation would be severe and long-lasting. Against every instinct I had developed through years of navigating his manipulation, I decided to go through with the trip. I told myself that whatever Dad was planning, I was smart enough to handle it. I convinced myself that my fears were probably overblown, that my history with Dad was making me paranoid about what was likely just poor planning and unusual generosity. As I packed my small suitcase according to his bizarre instructions, I tried to focus on the slim possibility that this really was an attempt at reconciliation. Maybe Dad's secretiveness came from wanting to surprise us with an especially thoughtful itinerary. Maybe his defensiveness was just excitement that he couldn't contain properly. But deep down, as I folded my 3 carefully chosen outfits and placed my passport in my purse, I knew I was walking into some kind of trap. I just couldn't imagine how elaborate or cruel that trap might be. My alarm went off at 3:30 a.m. on April 20th, and I felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had become my constant companion over the past few weeks. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios and trying to convince myself that I was overthinking Dad's strange behavior. The drive to Denver International Airport took 45 minutes in the pre-dawn darkness. I kept checking my phone, expecting to see messages from Dad or Casey about gate numbers or meeting locations, but there was nothing. The international terminal was surprisingly busy for 4:45 a.m., filled with travelers heading to early morning flights to Europe and Asia. I found a seat in the main departures area and texted Dad, "I'm here. Where should I meet you?" The response came back immediately. "Looking for you now. Stay put." Casey arrived 10 minutes later, looking as tired and confused as I felt. "Have you seen Dad yet?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "He said he's looking for me, but that was 15 minutes ago. Did he give you any more details about our flight?" Casey shook his head. "Just the same instructions about being here early and letting him handle everything." I asked Elena about it yesterday when I stopped by to drop off their mail, and she got this weird look on her face and said she hoped everything would work out okay. The phrasing sent another chill through me. Elena had said she hoped everything would work out okay, not that she hoped we would have a good trip, as if there was some question about whether things would work out at all. At 5:15, Dad appeared in the departures area, walking briskly toward us with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was dressed in his usual travel uniform, khakis, polo shirt, and lightweight jacket, but something about his demeanor seemed forced, like an actor playing the role of an excited father rather than actually being one. "There are my world travelers," he announced loudly enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "Ready for the adventure of a lifetime?" "We're ready," I said carefully. "Where's our gate?" Dad's smile flickered for just a moment. "Let's get some coffee first and go over the final details," he said, steering us toward a nearby cafe. "I want to make sure everyone understands the plan." We found a table in the corner, and Dad ordered coffee for all of us, while Casey and I waited for him to finally provide the concrete information we had been requesting for weeks. When he returned with our drinks, Dad pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be travel confirmations. "All right," he began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used for business presentations. "Here's how this is going to work. Our flight to Rome leaves at 7:30 a.m. from gate B27. We'll have about a 4-hour layover in Frankfurt, then arrive in Rome at 11 p.m. local time." Finally, actual details. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe my paranoia had been unfounded after all. "I've got all our boarding passes right here," Dad continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out what looked like 3 folded documents and handed one to each of us. "Don't lose these. European airports are strict about documentation." I unfolded my boarding pass and immediately felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't a boarding pass at all. It was a printout of a travel website showing flight information, but with no barcode, no seat assignment, and no confirmation number. At the top, in bold letters, it said, "Sample itinerary, not a valid ticket." Casey was staring at his paper with the same confused expression. "Dad, this isn't a boarding pass. This is just a sample itinerary from a travel website." Dad's mask of enthusiasm slipped completely. The transformation was startling. One moment he was the jovial father planning a family adventure. The next he was cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. "That's correct," he said calmly, as if we were discussing the weather rather than discovering we had been systematically deceived. "You don't have tickets because you're not coming on this trip." The words hit like a physical blow. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline or the explanation that would make this make sense. "What do you mean we're not coming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "This trip was never about family bonding. It was about teaching you both a lesson about respect and gratitude." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. He had deliberately withheld information, given evasive answers, and created a mystery around every aspect of this trip, then blamed us for asking the reasonable questions that any responsible adult would ask about international travel? "You wanted us to be grateful for a trip we weren't actually taking?" I asked, my shock giving way to anger.
I wanted you to trust me, Dad snapped. I wanted you to show some appreciation for everything I do for this family instead of treating me like some kind of scam artist every time I try to do something nice. The projection was stunning. He was literally running a scam, bringing us to the airport with fake boarding passes while accusing us of treating him like a scam artist for asking basic questions about his plans. So what happens now? Casey asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. You just leave us here at the airport at 5:30 in the morning? Dad checked his watch with exaggerated concern. Actually, if I'm going to make my real flight, I need to head to security soon. Elena and Sophie are waiting for me at the gate. The final pieces clicked into place. Elena and Sophie were coming on the trip. After all, the family bonding experience was happening, just without Casey and me. We had been brought to the airport not to travel, but to be publicly humiliated and abandoned. You planned this entire thing just to embarrass us? I asked, still struggling to comprehend the elaborate cruelty of what he had orchestrated. I planned this to teach you a lesson. Maybe next time you'll think twice before questioning my generosity or demanding detailed explanations for every kind gesture I try to make. He stood up, shouldering his carry-on bag with the casual efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. Your cars are in the parking garage. You can figure out your own way home. Casey stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. You're seriously just leaving us here? You're adults, Dad said coldly. You can handle getting yourselves home from the airport. Consider it practice for the independence you both seem so eager to claim. I remained seated, frozen by the magnitude of his betrayal. This wasn't just about a canceled vacation or even public embarrassment. This was a deliberate psychological assault designed to punish us for the crime of asking reasonable questions about an international trip. Dad, I said quietly, looking up at him, with what I hoped was dignity rather than the devastation I felt inside. This is cruel. Even for you, this is exceptionally cruel. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or a fleeting recognition of how far he had gone. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by the cold satisfaction of someone who had successfully executed a plan. Cruelty would be letting you continue to take my generosity for granted. This is education. Maybe next time you'll think twice before questioning my generosity or demanding detailed explanations for every kind gesture I try to make. He stood up and walked away without another word, disappearing into the security checkpoint line with the confidence of someone who had just accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. Casey and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, watching other travelers hurry past with their legitimate boarding passes and actual vacation plans. The cafe around us buzzed with normal airport activity, people grabbing coffee before flights, checking departure boards, saying goodbye to loved ones, while we processed the fact that our father had just executed the most elaborate and humiliating practical joke of our lives. What do we do now? Casey asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. I looked at my fake boarding pass, then at my brother's shocked face, then at the departure board showing flights to destinations we would never see. I honestly have no idea, I admitted. But even as I said it, I knew that whatever we did next, it would be the beginning of something entirely different between us and our father. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And Robert Martinez had just sprinted across one of the biggest ones imaginable. The first hour after Dad disappeared into the security checkpoint passed in a haze of disbelief and practical concerns. Casey and I sat in that airport cafe, surrounded by our small suitcases and the fake boarding passes that had become evidence of the most elaborate betrayal either of us had ever experienced. I keep thinking this is some kind of test, Casey said, staring at his coffee cup. Like maybe Dad is going to come back and say, "Surprise! I wanted to see how you'd react," and then produce our real tickets. I understood the impulse to find some alternative explanation, some way to make this elaborate cruelty make sense within the framework of normal family dysfunction. But I had seen Dad's face when he revealed his deception. There had been no uncertainty there, no hint that this was anything other than exactly what he intended. "He's not coming back," I said quietly. "This was always the plan. Get us here early, humiliate us publicly, then leave us to figure out how to get home." The logistics were actually the easy part. We both had cars in the parking garage, we both had credit cards, and we were both familiar enough with Denver International Airport to navigate our way out. The emotional devastation was going to take much longer to process. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "How's the airport? Safe travels." The normalcy of the message hit me like a punch to the stomach. Jordan had no idea that the European vacation she had wished me well on was never real, that I was sitting in an airport cafe at 6 a.m., processing the fact that my father had orchestrated this entire scenario just to prove he could. I called her without thinking about the early hour. "Alex?" Jordan's voice was groggy, but immediately concerned. "Aren't you supposed to be on a plane right now?" "Can you come pick me up from the airport?" I asked, my voice cracking for the first time since Dad had walked away. Something really bad happened. "I'm already getting dressed," Jordan said without hesitation. "Which terminal?" While we waited for Jordan to arrive, Casey and I started making other necessary phone calls. He needed to contact his supervisor to explain why he wouldn't need the vacation time he had requested after all. I needed to reach out to clients whose projects I had postponed for this fictional trip. But the hardest call was to Mom. "Alex, honey, what are you calling so early? Aren't you supposed to be flying to Europe today?" Mom's voice carried the same excited concern that Jordan's had, the assumption that I was checking in before a major adventure. "Mom," I began, then stopped, unsure how to even begin explaining what had happened. "Dad didn't actually buy tickets for Casey and me. He brought us to the airport and then left us here." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Mom finally spoke, her voice was very quiet and very controlled. "He did what?" I repeated the story, watching Casey pace near the window while talking to his boss. Mom listened without interrupting, but I could hear her breathing change as the full scope of Dad's deception became clear. "That son of a bitch," she said finally, with more venom than I had heard in her voice since the divorce proceedings. "That calculating, manipulative son of a bitch." The raw anger and Mom's reaction was somehow validating. For weeks, I had been questioning my own instincts, wondering if I was being paranoid or ungrateful. Hearing Mom's immediate fury confirmed that this wasn't normal family conflict. This was something else entirely. "I'm coming to get you, both of you, right now." "Jordan's already on her way," I told her. "But Mom, what do we do about this? How do we even respond to something like this?" Another long pause. "Honey, I think your father just showed you exactly who he is. The question now is what you're going to do with that information." When Jordan arrived, her expression shifted from concern to incredulous rage as I explained what had happened. "He brought you to the airport with fake boarding passes?" she repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it sound less insane. "This isn't a prank gone wrong. This is psychological warfare." The drive back to my apartment gave me time to start processing the broader implications of Dad's actions. This wasn't just about a canceled vacation or even public humiliation. This was about power and control, about punishing Casey and me for the crime of becoming independent adults who asked questions and maintained boundaries. "What's really sick," Jordan observed as we pulled into my apartment complex, "is how much planning this took. He had to research actual flights to make the fake itineraries convincing. He had to coordinate with Elena and Sophie. He had to maintain the lie for weeks while watching us get excited about spending time with him." She was right. This hadn't been a spontaneous act of cruelty. It had been a calculated campaign designed to maximize our emotional investment before the betrayal.
Dad had enjoyed watching us plan for a trip he knew we would never take, had probably relished our questions and concerns, knowing that he held the power to devastate us whenever he chose.
By noon, my phone was buzzing constantly with family reactions as news of Dad's airport stunt spread. Elena had apparently posted photos to social media showing her, Dad, and Sophie boarding their flight to Rome with captions about family adventures and making memories. Several relatives had seen the posts and were confused about why Casey and I weren't in the pictures. Aunt Patricia, Mom's sister, called first. "Linda told me what happened," she said without preamble. "Alex, honey, I am so sorry. I can't believe Robert would do something so deliberately cruel." But not all the family reactions were supportive. Uncle Mike, Dad's brother, left a voicemail that revealed how Dad had been preparing the ground for his narrative. "Alex, your dad mentioned you and Casey might not be able to make the trip at the last minute due to work conflicts," Uncle Mike's message said. "I hope you can work things out and maybe join them later in the week. Family trips are so important." The gaslighting was already beginning. Dad had created a cover story that reframed our absence as our choice rather than his deliberate exclusion. By the time he returned from Europe, the family narrative would probably be that Casey and I had bailed on a generous vacation due to work obligations or lack of appreciation for Dad's gesture. Casey came over that evening, and we spent hours trying to make sense of what had happened and what our response should be. "Part of me wants to just pretend this never happened," he admitted, "go back to our normal relationship with Dad and never mention the airport thing again." I understood the appeal of that approach. Confronting Dad about his deception would inevitably lead to more conflict, more gaslighting, and probably months of family drama. It would be easier to absorb this humiliation quietly and try to move forward. But I kept thinking about Dr. Thompson, the therapist I had seen briefly after college to deal with anxiety about family relationships. She had talked about enabling dysfunctional behavior by failing to address it directly. By accepting Dad's treatment without consequences, Casey and I would be signaling that this level of manipulation was acceptable. "What if we don't pretend it never happened?" I asked. "What if we actually hold him accountable for this?" Casey looked skeptical. "How do you hold someone accountable for something like this? It's not like he broke a law or stole our money. He just lied to us and humiliated us." "Maybe that's exactly what makes it so important to address," I said. "Because if we let him get away with this, what's going to stop him from doing something even worse next time?" The question hung in the air between us as we contemplated a future where our father felt entitled to orchestrate increasingly elaborate punishments for the crime of not meeting his expectations. The airport incident wasn't just about a fake vacation. It was about establishing his power to control and humiliate us whenever we stepped out of line. As I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling and replaying the morning's events, I realized that Casey's question was exactly the right one. Who does something like this to their own children? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of children do we become if we allow someone to treat us this way without consequences?
The decision to confront Dad came gradually over the next 3 days, solidified by a series of revelations that exposed just how deep his deception had run. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Sophie. On Wednesday evening, I received a text from Sophie's number that immediately caught my attention. "Alex, this is actually Elena. Can you call me when you have a minute? There are some things you need to know about the trip." I called immediately, my heart racing with anticipation and dread. Elena answered on the first ring, her voice careful and quiet. "Alex, I want you to know that I had no idea Robert was planning to deceive you and Casey," she began without preamble. "I thought this whole thing was suspicious, but I never imagined he would do something so deliberately cruel." The relief of having my instincts validated was overwhelming, but Elena's next revelation was even more significant. "The trip was never about family bonding," she continued. "Robert has been planning to use this time to handle some business matters that he didn't want you or Casey to know about. He needed you both out of the picture, but he also needed an alibi for being out of the country." "What kind of business matters?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer.
Elena's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she had changed her mind about confiding in me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Robert's company is in serious financial trouble. He's been hiding it from everyone, including me, until recently. There are some irregularities in his business accounts that he's trying to resolve before they become public. He needed to be out of the country while certain investigations were conducted. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Dad hadn't brought Casey and me to the airport to teach us a lesson about gratitude. He had brought us there to establish an alibi. If anyone questioned his whereabouts during this crucial period, there would be witnesses who saw him at the airport with his children, apparently leaving on a family vacation. Elena, I said carefully, are you saying Dad is under investigation for financial crimes? She said, I'm saying that Robert has been making some very poor decisions with his business finances, and there are people who want answers, she replied diplomatically. The airport thing with you and Casey was supposed to make it look like he was being a devoted father taking his kids on a dream vacation, instead of someone fleeing the country to avoid accountability. The calculated nature of his betrayal was even more devastating than I had initially realized. Casey and I hadn't just been collateral damage in some petty power play, we had been unwitting props in an elaborate cover-up of Dad's business failures. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Elena sighed deeply. Because what he did to you and Casey was wrong, and because I think you deserve to know the truth about why it happened. Also because I'm worried about what he might do next to protect himself. That last comment sent chills through me. What do you mean? Robert is very good at making other people responsible for his problems, Elena said carefully. If his business issues become public, he's going to need someone to blame. I don't want that someone to be you or Casey. After we hung up, I called Casey immediately and shared Elena's revelations. My brother's response was swift and furious. So we weren't just humiliated for his entertainment, we were used as props in some kind of financial fraud cover-up? Casey said, his voice tight with controlled anger. It looks that way, I confirmed. Elena thinks he's going to try to blame us for his business problems somehow. How could he possibly blame us for his business problems? I had been thinking about that question since Elena's call. Remember how he's been asking about our finances lately and that weird conversation Michelle overheard at the bank about temporary account access? Casey was quiet for a moment. You think he was planning to use our account somehow? I think Dad has been setting up multiple contingency plans. The airport thing was just one part of whatever he's been orchestrating. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the office of Michelle Parker, a lawyer who specialized in family legal matters and financial fraud. I had found her through an online search, and her initial consultation fee seemed reasonable for someone in my financial situation. Michelle listened to my story with professional attention, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that helped me organize the timeline of Dad's suspicious behavior. What you're describing sounds like potential identity fraud and preparation for a larger financial scheme, she said when I finished. The fact that he was researching account access while planning to be out of the country suggests he may have been setting up some kind of financial manipulation that would occur while he had an alibi. What kind of business matters? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Is there anything I can do to protect myself?
Absolutely, Michelle replied. First, we need to secure all your financial accounts immediately. Second, we should document everything you've told me in a formal statement. Third, I'd recommend contacting the authorities about your suspicions regarding your father's business activities. The idea of reporting Dad to authorities felt overwhelming, but Michelle's next comment crystallized the necessity. If your father is under investigation for business fraud and he's been researching access to your accounts, there's a good chance he was planning to implicate you somehow, she explained. The best way to protect yourself is to establish a clear record that you had no knowledge or involvement in whatever he's been planning. That afternoon, I met with a detective from the Denver Police Department's white-collar crime unit. Detective Sarah Chen listened to my story with the same professional attention Michelle had shown, but her questions were more focused on Dad's specific actions and timeline. We've actually been aware of some irregularities at your father's construction company, Detective Chen told me after I finished my account. Your information about the fake airport trip and the account access research could be very helpful to our investigation. The revelation that Dad was already under official scrutiny felt both validating and terrifying. My instincts about his behavior hadn't been paranoia. They had been accurate assessments of someone engaged in criminal activity. What happens now? I asked. Now we continue our investigation with the additional information you've provided, Detective Chen replied. I would strongly recommend that you monitor your financial accounts closely and report any unauthorized activity immediately. I'd also suggest limiting your contact with your father until this matter is resolved. Casey was waiting for me when I got home that evening, having let himself in with the spare key I had given him years earlier. His expression was grim as he handed me a printed email. "This came while you were at the police station," he said. The email was from Dad, sent from his phone while supposedly enjoying his European vacation. The subject line read, "Disappointed, but not surprised." The message was classic Dad, a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as wounded parental concern. Alex and Casey, I had hoped that some time apart might help you both reflect on your attitudes toward family and gratitude. Unfortunately, I'm hearing from relatives that you're spreading negative stories about our trip and making me look like the villain for trying to create a meaningful family experience. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that rather than taking responsibility for your own lack of commitment to family relationships, you've chosen to blame me for your decision not to join us in Europe. Elena and Sophie have been asking why you decided not to come, and I've been trying to protect your reputations by suggesting you had work conflicts. But if you're going to publicly embarrass me with false narratives about our family dynamics, then perhaps it's time for some honesty about your priorities and character. I'll be back next week and we can discuss this situation then. I still love you both, despite your current choices. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its scope. Dad had rewritten the entire airport incident, transforming it from his deliberate deception into our voluntary absence from the family trip. He had positioned himself as the protective father, covering for our supposed abandonment of the family trip, while simultaneously threatening to expose our true character if we continued to contradict his narrative. He's really going to try to convince everyone that we chose not to go, Casey said, reading my expression. He's going to make us the villains in this story. I looked at my brother, then at the email, then at the legal documents I had received from Michelle Parker and Detective Chen. Not if we tell the truth first, and not if he's too busy dealing with his own legal problems to focus on rewriting family history. The time for avoiding confrontation had passed. Dad had made his choice when he decided to use Casey and me as props in his financial fraud scheme. Now it was time for us to make ours.
The week Dad spent in Europe gave Casey and me time to build our case and prepare for his return. Working with Michelle Parker, we documented every suspicious interaction, every evasive answer, and every red flag we had ignored in the lead-up to the airport incident. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its calculated precision. Michelle helped me understand the legal implications of Dad's behavior. What your father did goes beyond emotional manipulation, she explained during our second meeting. Using you as an alibi for potential criminal activity could constitute conspiracy charges if prosecutors can prove intent. The fake boarding passes and elaborate deception show premeditation. On her advice, I took several protective steps. I froze my credit reports with all 3 major bureaus, changed passwords on every financial account, and set up fraud alerts that would notify me of any attempts to access my information. I also opened new checking and savings accounts at a different bank, one where Dad had no existing relationships or potential influence. Casey was initially reluctant to take such drastic measures. "This feels like we're treating Dad like a criminal," he said when I explained Michelle's recommendations. "Casey, Dad is under investigation by police for financial crimes. He used us as alibis for whatever he was planning. At what point do we stop pretending this is normal family dysfunction and start protecting ourselves?" The breakthrough moment came when Casey contacted his ex-girlfriend, Michelle, who had overheard Dad's suspicious bank conversation. She agreed to meet with us and provide a written statement about what she had witnessed. Your dad definitely mentioned something about temporary access to accounts in your names, she confirmed. When he saw me, he looked panicked and ended the conversation immediately. The bank manager seemed uncomfortable too, like they were discussing something that wasn't quite above board. With Michelle's statement in hand, Casey finally understood the scope of what Dad had been planning. He was really going to use our identities somehow, he said, staring at the document. This isn't just about the airport humiliation. He was setting us up to be involved in whatever financial scheme he's running. We spent the next few days reaching out to other family members who might have information about Dad's recent behavior. The conversations were revealing and disturbing in equal measure. Aunt Patricia, Mom's sister, had noticed Dad asking unusual questions about Mom's financial situation during recent family gatherings. He kept asking if Linda had any investments or retirement accounts that might need professional management, Patricia told me. It seemed odd at the time, but Robert always acts like he knows more about money than everyone else. Uncle Mike, Dad's brother, provided even more concerning information when Casey approached him directly. Robert has been asking about borrowing against the family cabin up in the mountains, Mike revealed. He said he had a temporary cash flow issue and needed quick access to equity. When I asked for details about repayment, he got defensive and said I didn't trust family. The family cabin belonged to Dad's parents' estate and was jointly owned by Dad, Uncle Mike, and their sister Karen. Any attempt to borrow against it would require all three signatures, which explained why Dad needed to be out of the country while manipulating financial documents. "Did you sign anything?" Casey asked. "No," Mike replied. "I told him I needed to discuss it with Karen first. Robert said not to worry about it, that he had other options. But now I'm wondering if those other options involved using your accounts somehow." By Thursday, we had assembled a comprehensive timeline of Dad's suspicious activities stretching back several months. The pattern was clear. He had been systematically researching access to family members' financial accounts while setting up alibis and cover stories for his absence during crucial periods. Detective Chen was impressed with our documentation when we met for a follow-up appointment. She said this level of planning suggests your father has been orchestrating a complex fraud scheme. The airport incident may have been designed to create witnesses who could testify that he was leaving the country for legitimate family reasons, rather than fleeing potential charges. "What happens when he gets back?" I ask. "We'll be ready for him," Detective Chen replied. "Thanks to your information, we've been able to trace some of his recent financial activities. When he returns, we'll have enough evidence to bring him in for questioning." The thought of Dad being arrested was surreal and terrifying, despite everything he had done. Casey and I had grown up believing that, whatever his flaws, Dad was fundamentally law-abiding and successful. Discovering that he was apparently a criminal mastermind who had been planning to implicate his own children in his schemes required a complete reframing of our understanding of who he was.
On Friday evening, Elena called with an update from Europe. "Robert has been acting very strangely during this trip," she reported. "He's constantly checking his phone and making business calls at odd hours. Yesterday, he got a call that made him go completely white. When I asked what was wrong, he said there were some complications with his business that he needed to handle when we get back." "Elena," I said carefully, "when you get back, there are going to be police waiting to question Dad about his business activities. Are you prepared for that?" The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was very small. "I was afraid of something like this. Robert has been making strange financial decisions for months, but every time I questioned them, he told me I didn't understand business." "What kind of decisions?" "Large cash withdrawals, meetings with people he wouldn't identify, documents he kept locked in his office safe. When I asked to see our tax returns last month, he said they were too complicated for me to understand and that I should trust him to handle our finances." The classic pattern of financial abuse was emerging even within Dad's current marriage. Elena had been kept deliberately ignorant of his business activities, just as Mom had been years earlier. "Elena, you need to protect yourself financially," I warned. "If Dad has been using your joint accounts for illegal activities, you could be implicated, even if you had no knowledge of what he was doing." After that call, I felt a deep sadness settling over me, alongside the anger and betrayal. Dad hadn't just manipulated Casey and me, he had apparently been deceiving Elena and potentially putting her at legal risk as well. The man we had thought we knew, the successful businessman and devoted husband, was apparently a facade covering someone willing to destroy his family to protect his own interests. Saturday morning brought Dad's return flight. According to Elena's earlier text, they were scheduled to land at Denver International Airport at 2:30 p.m., the same airport where he had abandoned Casey and me just 1 week earlier. But this time, Detective Chen and her team would be waiting in the arrival area. Michelle Parker had prepared cease and desist letters demanding that Dad make no further attempts to access our financial information. And Casey and I had made peace with the fact that our relationship with our father was about to change permanently. "Are you ready for this?" Casey asked as we sat in my apartment that afternoon, waiting for news. I thought about the scared, eager-to-please daughter who had packed a small suitcase just 1 week earlier, hoping for reconciliation and bonding with a father who had instead used her as a prop in an elaborate criminal scheme. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in years, I truly meant it. The phone rang at 3:45 p.m. It was Detective Chan. "She have him in custody," she said simply. "Robert Martinez has been arrested on charges of attempted fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. You and Casey are safe." The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a profound sadness for the father we had thought we knew and the family relationships that would never be the same. The man who had taught me to read blueprints and praised my first art projects was also the man who had planned to use my identity to cover his crimes. Some betrayals are too deep to ever fully heal from, but as Casey and I sat together that evening, processing the end of our father's freedom and the beginning of our own, I realized that healing wasn't really the point. The point was learning to protect ourselves, to trust our instincts, and to build relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. Dad had taught us that lesson in the cruelest way possible, but it was still a lesson worth learning.
Dad's arrest triggered a cascade of revelations that painted an even more disturbing picture of his criminal activities than we had initially understood. Over the following weeks, Detective Chen kept Casey and me informed about the investigation's progress, and each new detail reinforced how close we had come to being unwitting accomplices in serious financial crimes. The charges against Dad were extensive. Embezzlement from his construction company, attempted identity theft involving multiple family members, fraud related to property loans, and conspiracy to defraud financial institutions. The evidence included forged documents bearing signatures that looked suspiciously like mine and Casey's, loan applications for properties we had never seen, and bank records showing attempts to establish accounts using our social security numbers. "Your father had been planning this scheme for at least 6 months, Detective Chen explained during a meeting at the police station. The European trip was meant to establish his alibi during the critical period when the fraudulent transactions would be processed. If you hadn't come forward with your suspicions, you both could have faced charges as co-conspirators." The relief of avoiding criminal liability was tempered by the shocking revelation of how thoroughly Dad had researched our financial lives. He had copies of our credit reports, bank statements going back 2 years, and employment verification documents that we had never authorized. The violation felt almost as devastating as the original airport betrayal. Michelle Parker helped us understand the legal process and our rights as victims of identity theft. "Even though the attempted fraud was unsuccessful, you both have grounds for civil suits against your father," she explained. "The emotional distress, the time and money spent protecting your identities, and the potential damage to your credit histories all constitute damages you could recover." The idea of suing Dad felt surreal, but Michelle's practical advice was sound. "Filing civil suits also creates additional legal separation between you and your father's criminal activities," she noted. "It establishes clearly that you were victims, not willing participants." Casey struggled more than I did with the decision to pursue civil action. "He's our father," he said during one of our many conversations about how to proceed. "Even after everything he's done, the idea of suing him for money feels wrong." I understood Casey's reluctance, but my perspective had fundamentally shifted since discovering the scope of Dad's deception. He stopped being our father the moment he decided to use us as tools in his criminal enterprise. Filing suit isn't about money, it's about accountability and protection. The media attention surrounding Dad's arrest was minimal but locally significant. His construction company had been involved in several high-profile commercial projects, and news of his embezzlement charges made the business section of the Denver Post. Reading about local businessman Robert Martinez being charged with fraud felt like reading about a stranger who happened to share our last name. Elena's situation became increasingly complicated as the investigation progressed. While she wasn't charged with any crimes, prosecutors determined that their joint accounts had been used to fund some of Dad's illegal activities. She hired her own attorney and began the process of divorcing Dad while cooperating with the investigation. "I keep thinking about all the warning signs I ignored," she told me during a difficult phone conversation. "The secretive meetings, the cash transactions, the way he dismissed my questions about our finances. I feel like such a fool for trusting him." "You're not a fool," I assured her. "Dad is an expert manipulator. He made a career out of making people trust him while he was betraying them." Elena's cooperation with prosecutors provided crucial evidence about Dad's activities during the months leading up to his arrest. She turned over documents from his home office, recordings of suspicious phone calls she had secretly made, and detailed financial records that traced the movement of embezzled funds. "Elena's evidence basically sealed the case," Detective Chen informed us. "Your father will almost certainly plead guilty rather than face trial with this level of documentation against him." The plea negotiations took several weeks, during which Dad remained in county jail, unable to make the substantial bail that had been set. His lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Crawford, contacted Mitchell Parker about potential plea arrangements that would involve restitution to victims. "Your father is willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for making full financial restitution to all victims," Crawford explained during a conference call with Mitchell, Casey, and me. The offer was tempting from a practical standpoint. It would provide immediate resolution and financial compensation without the uncertainty of a trial. But it also felt like another attempt by Dad to control the narrative and minimize the consequences of his actions. "What does reduced charges mean exactly?" I asked. Crawford's explanation revealed that Dad was hoping to avoid the most serious felony charges that could result in significant prison time. "Mr. Martinez is willing to accept responsibility for his actions, but he's hoping for a sentence that would allow him to eventually rebuild his relationship with his family." The presumption that Casey and I would want to rebuild our relationship with Dad after everything he had done was stunning. Even facing serious criminal charges, he apparently couldn't imagine that his children might choose to permanently distance themselves from him. Casey and I requested time to consider the plea offer, but our decision was made easier by additional information that emerged during the investigation. Detective Chen discovered that Dad had been planning similar identity theft schemes involving other family members, including our teenage cousin and elderly grandmother. He had preliminary research files on 6 different family members, Detective Chen reported. Social security numbers, employment information, credit histories. If his scheme with your accounts had been successful, he would have moved on to victimizing other relatives. The revelation that Dad had been prepared to exploit our most vulnerable family members, particularly our grandmother, who trusted him completely, eliminated any remaining sympathy I might have felt for his situation. "We're not accepting any plea deal that reduces his charges," I told Michelle Parker. "If Dad wants to take responsibility for his actions, he can do it by accepting the full consequences, not by negotiating for a lighter sentence." Casey agreed, though he struggled with the decision. "I keep thinking about how this affects Sophie. She's going to grow up knowing her stepfather is a convicted felon because of choices we made about prosecution."
It was a fair concern, but ultimately, Sophie's future was Elena's responsibility, not ours. Our responsibility was to protect ourselves and other potential victims from Dad's predatory behavior. The final plea hearing was scheduled for early June, almost 2 months after Dad's arrest. Michelle Parker arranged for Casey and me to provide victim impact statements that would be considered during sentencing, giving us an opportunity to formally address the court about how Dad's actions had affected our lives. Writing my victim impact statement forced me to confront the full scope of the emotional damage Dad had inflicted. The airport betrayal was just the most dramatic incident in a lifetime of manipulation and control. His willingness to use me as an unwitting accomplice in criminal activity represented the ultimate violation of whatever trust had remained between us.
18 months after that devastating morning at Denver International Airport, I stood in the parking lot of the Colorado State Penitentiary, holding an unopened letter from Dad. It was his third attempt to contact me since his sentencing to 5 years in prison for fraud and identity theft. Like the previous two, this letter would go directly into my shredder, unread. The decision to maintain complete no contact with Dad hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary for my healing. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist I had been seeing since shortly after Dad's arrest, helped me understand that forgiveness and relationship restoration are separate concepts. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind while still choosing not to have them in your life, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our early sessions. Forgiveness doesn't require you to expose yourself to continued harm or manipulation. The therapy process had been challenging but transformative. Through weekly sessions, I began to recognize patterns of manipulation that had shaped my entire life, not just the dramatic airport incident. Dad's control had been so pervasive that I had learned to second-guess my own perceptions and defer to his judgment, even when it contradicted my instincts. Your father trained you to ignore red flags, Dr. Martinez observed. Recovery means learning to trust your own assessment of situations and people, even when others pressure you to override your instincts. Casey's healing journey had taken a different path. After months of individual therapy and several difficult family conversations, he had chosen to maintain limited contact with Dad through supervised visits and carefully monitored phone calls. His approach wasn't wrong, it was simply different from mine. I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know I tried to maintain some kind of relationship, Casey explained during one of our weekly coffee meetings. But I'll never trust him again, and I'll never let him have access to any part of my life that matters. The boundaries Casey had established were impressive in their specificity. Dad could call once per month for exactly 15 minutes. Conversations were limited to general topics, no discussions of finances, family members, or Dad's legal situation. Casey's new girlfriend wasn't mentioned, his address remained secret, and any attempt by Dad to manipulate or guilt trip would result in immediate termination of contact. Our relationship with Elena and Sophie had evolved in unexpected ways. Elena's divorce from Dad had been finalized 6 months after his sentencing, and she had moved across the country to start over near her sister's family. But she stayed in regular contact with Casey and we had developed a genuine friendship based on shared experience of Dad's manipulation. I feel like I understand your childhood in a way I never did before, Elena told me during one of our monthly video calls. Living with Robert's need to control everything and everyone was exhausting. I can't imagine growing up with that level of psychological pressure. Sophie, now 17, had struggled with the revelation of Dad's crimes and the subsequent family dissolution. Elena had made the difficult decision to be completely honest with her daughter about what had happened, believing that transparency was healthier than secrets and half-truths. Sophie has been in therapy to process everything, Elena shared. She feels guilty for the photos she posted on social media during the Europe trip, not knowing that you and Casey had been deliberately excluded. She wants to reach out to you both, but she's not sure how. Casey and I eventually arranged a video call with Sophie, who tearfully apologized for unwittingly participating in Dad's deception. She said, "I should have questioned why you guys weren't with us. I knew something felt weird about the whole trip, but I didn't want to ruin it by asking difficult questions." "Sophie, you were 15, I replied gently. "It wasn't your responsibility to figure out that Dad was lying to everyone. You were just a kid enjoying a vacation." The conversation with Sophie was healing for all of us. She needed to know that Casey and I didn't blame her for Dad's actions, and we needed to maintain our connection with her despite the complicated family circumstances. My relationship with Mom had deepened significantly throughout this ordeal. She had been my strongest supporter during the legal proceedings and had provided practical help with everything from court dates to therapy referrals. But more importantly, she had finally shared her own experiences with Dad's manipulation during their marriage. "I should have protected you and Casey better," Mom admitted during a particularly difficult conversation. "I knew your father was controlling and manipulative, but I didn't realize the extent of the psychological damage he was causing." "You were dealing with your own survival," I assured her. "Dad was manipulating you, too. You can't protect your children from something when you're struggling to protect yourself."
Mom's honesty about her experiences helped me understand that Dad's abusive behavior wasn't a response to our family's particular dynamics. It was simply who he was. This realization was crucial for my healing because it eliminated the self-blame and guilt that had been eating away at me. The professional consequences of dealing with Dad's crimes had been significant but manageable. I had lost several weeks of work during the initial crisis and legal proceedings, which affected my income for months afterward. But many of my clients had been understanding about the circumstances, and I had eventually built my freelance business back up to its previous level. More importantly, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about professional boundaries and client relationships. I became much better at recognizing potential red flags in business relationships and more confident about ending arrangements that felt manipulative or exploitative. "What happened with your father was like a masterclass in recognizing manipulation," my friend Jordan observed. "You're probably going to be able to spot dishonest people much more easily now." She was right. The painful experience with Dad had sharpened my ability to assess people's motivations and trustworthiness. I found myself naturally skeptical of grand gestures, vague promises, and anyone who seemed to be trying too hard to win my trust quickly. This heightened awareness had also improved my personal relationships. I started dating someone new, Marcus, a teacher I met through a mutual friend, and I was struck by how different a healthy relationship felt. Marcus was direct about his intentions, consistent in his behavior, and respectful of my boundaries. There were no games, no hidden agendas, and no attempts to make me doubt my own perceptions. "It's weird," I told Dr. Martinez during therapy. "With Marcus, I don't have to constantly analyze his motives or wonder what he really means when he says something. He just says what he means." "That's what healthy communication looks like," Dr. Martinez replied. "Your relationship with your father trained you to expect deception and manipulation as normal parts of interpersonal interaction. Learning to recognize and appreciate straightforward honesty is part of your healing process." As I reflected on the 18 months since the airport incident, I realized that Dad had inadvertently given me an unexpected gift. His betrayal had been so dramatic and undeniable that it forced me to confront patterns of manipulation that might otherwise have taken years to recognize and address. The airport abandonment had felt like the end of the world at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of my real life. A life where I trusted my own instincts, maintained healthy boundaries, and chose relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear and obligation. Standing in that prison parking lot, holding Dad's unopened letter, I felt a profound sense of peace. Not because I had forgiven him — forgiveness was still a work in progress —
but because I had finally learned to protect myself from his ability to cause harm. I walked to the trash can near the parking lot entrance and dropped the letter inside without a second thought. Then I got in my car and drove home to the life I had built on my own terms, surrounded by people who loved me without conditions and supported my growth without trying to control my choices. The scared, eager-to-please daughter who had packed for a European vacation that never existed was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than honesty and respect from the people in her life. Dad's final lesson, delivered through his cruelest act of manipulation, had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from someone who can't or won't stop causing harm. It was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And for that, at least, I could almost feel grateful. Have you ever had to set boundaries with a family member who consistently violated your trust or manipulated your emotions? The courage it takes to protect yourself from someone you love can be overwhelming, but sometimes it's the only path to healing. If you've experienced family manipulation or had to make difficult decisions about cutting contact with toxic relatives, you're not alone. Drop a comment sharing your experience or a boundary you're proud of establishing. Like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and building healthier relationships. Remember that choosing your own well-being over family expectations isn't selfish, it's necessary. True family supports your growth and respects your boundaries rather than punishing you for having them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.